Well, how do you do? And it's very nice to be back in Berkeley yet again. Unfortunately, this is one of the worst times in the history of the human race. And I don't know how many heard me on Dennis Bernstein tonight? Yeah. I think that we've never been in such a dangerous position ever. I keep thinking of Germany, and the only way evil flourishes is for good people to do nothing. And that's what's happening. A lot of people are concerned, but a lot of people are frightened, and I don't understand the fear because this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I don't feel frightened, and I'm an Australian, and they could easily stop me travelling. They could take away my green card and put me in Guantanamo Bay, which actually my publisher says would be a good thing because it would give a lot of publicity to the book. But I'm not frightened of these characters. Well, I'm frightened of what they're doing, but I'm not frightened of them. And we've got to do something about them because truly they're putting the Earth in the intensive care unit. We have an acute clinical emergency and we could all be blown off the face of the planet. These people are nuclear bandits and they actually remind me of The Sopranos, if you watch that show, which I think is very brilliant. So let me start at the beginning, I guess. There's a paper written called Rebuilding America's Defences, Strategies, Forces and Resources for a New Century, the Project for a New American Century, September 2000. Now, this was first mooted in the early 90s, and what it says is America's going to be the new superpower, take over the whole world militarily, totally dominate the world. And I can't tell you how I feel about that. I mean, how dare they? America's only 5% of the world's population. The rest of us are us. And we don't want you anywhere near us. We don't want your McDonald's, your Starbucks, any of that garbage. We want to be able to live in peace with our own culture and our own creativity, and we don't want to be dominated by anyone, let alone militarily. Anyway, this was written by the right-wing neocons, for the right-wing neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Freeth, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the whole mob. And when it was first mooted in the 1990s, they said that they would use whatever military force necessary, and I thought they won't do that. That's just silly, whistling in the wind. And I suppose people felt like that when they read Mein Kampf. I don't want anyone to get offended with what I say. I want you to stick with me, don't walk out. And then they rewrote it in 1998 and then in the year 2000. And indeed, what they say is they will use nuclear weapons on any country they so desire. Libya, I mean really big countries. Libya, Syria, Cuba, North Korea. But eventually they're setting up China to be the new Cold War enemy, and I'll get into that in a minute, but that's all described in this book. The Pentagon is writing about it. They're ringing China with military bases because clearly they need the business, because war is good for business. Then they write about Star Wars. America's going to dominate space, which happens to be a global commons, and they're going to militarize space and put orbiting nuclear reactors, orbiting laser beam weapons, orbiting particle beam weapons, anti-satellite weapons, and they're going to dominate space, although it belongs to all of us. So when you read this, you understand what's going on. Without reading this, you won't actually know what the overall plan of these people in the White House is. And they're systematically proceeding to fulfill their plan. You all know that last year they wrote a new nuclear posture review and decided that they would use nuclear weapons for the first time on non-nuclear nations. That's never been part of the American policy before. It was always to only use nuclear weapons on nuclear nations. But behind this, the background of what I'm saying is this, and that's what I discovered when I wrote this book. We all worked like mad in the 80s to try and eradicate nuclear weapons. We were all scared. 80% of the American people wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, even though when I went to see Ronald Reagan in the White House, I met his daughter in the Playboy Mansion, where there is such a building, and I was talking to a group of film stars with Paul Newman because who's the guy who owns Playboy? Heffernan. Yeah, he was excerpting a book called With Enough Shovels by Robert Scheer. And you remember in those days, your FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, said, don't worry about nuclear war. If there are enough shovels to go around, we're all going to make it. And in the half an hour it took from woe to go, from the weapons being launched to landing on America, you got out your trusty shovel. This is for real. You dug a hole 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and you got in the hole. Then you put 2 doors on top of your hole and 3 feet of dirt. And there was a man who ran this system in FEMA called T.K. Jones, and T.K. Jones said, it's the dirt that does it. They also had evacuation plans for you all. On the day one, all the odd-numbered number plate cars leave. There's to be no panic. You have to take your checkbooks, your credit cards, your insurance policies. You leave behind any drugs or alcohol and food for the cat and dog. Oh, and tampons. And so you all had to evacuate to a designated town, and the next day the even-numbered number plate cars left, and if you got stuck on the side of the road, you drove your car and you dug a hole and got underneath the car and waited till the nuclear war was over, and then you got out and drove the car away. So this book was called With Enough Shovels, and it was to be excerpted in Playboy magazine. Well, after I spoke, and my agent said to me, now be emotional, because these are film stars, don't be scientific or medical. And I said, you know, we're probably the only life in the universe, and when you go out tonight, look up at the stars and realise that we may be the only life in the universe, and what responsibility we have to save it. And Patty Davis came up to me, who was Reagan's daughter, and she said, I want you to see my father. I think you're the only one on earth who can change his mind. And I said, well, I'll see him, but I don't want Ed Meese there or Jim Baker or Diva, Michael Diva. And she said, okay. So she called me 2 days later and said, we've got an hour at the end of his working day. And I said, what time is that? She said, 4 o'clock. So we had lunch in a French restaurant, and we were in this big black limo and walkie-talkie agents. We drove into the southern portico. We got out. We went into the downstairs library, in which there were no books. And we waited for a while. I was a bit nervous because it was the president, and I was scared of him. And he came in all dithery, and he didn't take my hand, so I shook his hand and said, how do you do, Mr. President? And then he didn't know where to sit, and there was a table at the back of the room, a long table. I said, you sit there and I'll sit here. And Patty sat opposite us. She didn't say anything. We were there for an hour and a quarter. I had more time with him in private than any other person in his 2 consecutive terms of office, 8 years. They kept him hidden. And then he started. I said, well, you probably don't know who I am, do you? And he said, yes, you're an Australian. You read On the Beach when you're a young girl and you're scared of nuclear weapons. And I said, yeah. He said, well, I too am scared of nuclear war, but our ways to prevent it differ. I believe in building more bombs. And we're off to a great start. He spent more money than all past presidents combined, mostly on the military. And then he just didn't know any data or statistics. I just finished Missile Envy, and I had facts pouring out of my eyes and ears and mouth. And he'd say a few things, and I would stop him and correct him. And remember when he got anxious, he'd get a red flush on his cheeks, he'd get uptight. So I'd take his hand and I'd pat it and reassure him. And as a physician, I was analysing his IQ, because you have to with patients. You have to know approximately how intelligent they are to make sure they put their suppository in at 6 a.m. and they take this tablet before breakfast and one after breakfast. And I guessed his IQ is about 100. That's what I would have said. He was a nice old man. He would have been a good chicken farmer. He was good at digging post stumps in his ranch, but he was totally inappropriate as President of the United States. So I left the White House really in a state of abject terror, having seen face to face who the Commander-in-Chief was and who gets to press the button. I didn't think I had much effect on him, and however later I thought maybe I had, because he did work with Gorbachev. And if you remember, they went to Reykjavik in Iceland and spent 2 days, and 2 mere mortals almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the planet. However, Reagan was attached to his Star Wars concept. Gorbachev wouldn't accept it, and they parted. And if you remember seeing George Shultz after that momentous historical event, he was absolutely shattered. He said, we did this, and then we reached this, and incidentally, The Americans came with no facts or figures, no plans, but the Russians were very well prepared. So here's Reagan and Gorbachev downstairs. It was a tiny house. Upstairs in the bathroom, sitting on the lavatory with a board over the bath, was Richard Pearl. And Richard Pearl was doing all the numbers and trying to work out what they were going to do. And in the basement were the KGB, protecting Gorbachev, but they got a bit drunk on vodka, and they tossed a lighted match into the waste paper basket and caught fire, and they nearly burnt the whole place down. I went there and I was told this by the Icelanders. So Schultz was excited. You could see his body language. We did this, and then we did this, and at the end his face just fell, and he said, but it didn't come to any conclusion. And that gave a vision of what we could do. And when people say we can't get rid of nuclear weapons, that's a ridiculous statement, because we almost did, but we missed the opportunity. And then Schultz turned into a great statesperson and worked with Shevardnadze, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Russia, and they worked brilliantly together. Then was elected George I. Now, George I did work for the CIA, but in retrospect, he actually did a few good things. He unilaterally eliminated quite a lot of tactical nuclear weapons, removed them from the Korean peninsula, thank God, with what's happening now. And he said, I have to help Gorbachev because he's got a belligerent military, and I have to help him and make some unilateral moves. And then was elected one William Jefferson Clinton. Now, Clinton is a very intelligent man with great charisma. However, he's got no courage, and he wasn't a true leader. So what he did when he got elected was set up a nuclear posture review headed by former Senator Les Aspin. Aspin looked at the data, and he saw that as they dropped the bombs, Moscow just turned into a huge blaze of red. There are about 60 hydrogen bombs targeted on Moscow, because they have a plan in the military called SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plan, where as the weapons were pumped out of the labs and the corporations, junior officers, never did the president oversee this planning and targeting strategy, nor the senior officers. It was junior officers. It was almost pin the tail on the donkey. We'll drop one there and we'll do. There was such a redundancy of weapons. Railway stations, railroad crossings were targeted, shoe factories, anything the enemy holds most dear, America puts at risk. And as one person said in the military, I don't care what the enemy holds most dear, if he, and it's always a he notice, values grandmothers, we target grandmothers. And I was particularly offended by that statement because I'm a grandmother. So during the Cold War, PSYOP had 2,500 targets in Russia. There are only 240 major cities in the Northern Hemisphere, okay? But since then, since the Cold War ended, they've now got 3,000 targets. China's targeted for the first time for a long time. Russia and Australia's terribly targeted because we've got 34 US military bases, including the biggest CIA base in the world that orchestrated this terrible thing in Iraq. And then Les died of a heart attack. Les said, we don't need the weapons, we're going to get rid of them. And he had a compliant man in the Kremlin called Yeltsin, who was a hardened alcoholic and really wasn't capable of doing much except he did work with the United States. Then a young man called Ashton Carter got into office. Now this is all written in a book by Jane Nolan, which I've referenced because I always wondered what happened. And Ashton Carter was young, altruistic, and no match for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they brutalised him the way the White House has been brutalising Colin Powell. Because you see, if you've worked at Harvard and I suppose Berkeley or in the hospitals or wherever, there's always a hierarchical structure. And those on the top, usually males, are the most brutal. And they brutalise each other. And I've seen it in medicine so often. But that's what's happening in the White House. So Ashton Carter was brutalised. They said they called ash to the carpet. And at the end of the posture review, nothing changed. The weapons were still on hair trigger alert. America's still got a policy to fight and win a nuclear war against Russia, lo and behold. And at the end, one general was heard to say, if you threaten our missiles and our early warning system, baby, that's threatening the family jewels, which I think is the most significant thing I'm going to say tonight, because the cause of this nuclear madness is the reptilian midbrain. and to compare the missiles to the male genitalia. I mean, there's some deep psychological pathology in that. And if you look at the Pentagon language, it's replete with sexual innuendos. Missile erectors, soft laydowns, deep penetration, hard lines, soft lines. We'll have a nuclear war like one big orgasmic wump. That's how they talk. In front of women on a stage, you know. They've got no shame or embarrassment. That's how it's like sports language. And I'll get into the etiology or cause of killing later that I've tried to analyse. So the weapons are still in place. America's got 2,500 on hair trigger alert, and Russia's got 2,500. And because, let me walk you through how America will fight and win a nuclear war. You knock out their eyes and ears, which are the satellites with infrared detectors which pick up the flame from the missiles. You knock out the command centre in Moscow. Then you launch your missiles. You've got over 3,000 hydrogen bombs on your Trident subs at sea at any one time, roving around quietly. And a commander, if he became psychotic and convinced his crew, can launch his missiles without communicating with the Pentagon. And they're only about 15 minutes away from Russia. So you launch them and your Minutemen missiles with 3 hydrogen bombs in them. The Trident missiles have 8 hydrogen bombs. It's called MIRVing, Multiple Independent Re-Entry Vehicle. And they're so accurate and guided by the GPS satellites that they land right on top of the missile silos and, quotes, kill the missiles. People are disassembled. People are seen as objective objects, and they don't have any humanity, and millions of people being killed in such an attack is called collateral damage by the Pentagon. Now the fact then, if you miss a few and Russia launches them and gets them up, you're setting up a missile defence to shoot them down, and there are various stages of the missile defence: boost phase, transit phase, terminal phase, and the like. I can go into that, but it's all in the book. So then you've won the nuclear war. You've killed their missiles. Now, because the Russians don't want their missiles killed and they think like your military do, madmen they are, they would launch their weapons to make sure your missiles hit empty silos. The trouble is 1,000 bombs dropping on 100 cities creates nuclear winter and the end of life on Earth. And we're talking about 5,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. So, and how does nuclear winter occur? The cities burn with a huge cloud of toxic black smoke which roils up and covers the earth so thick with a cloud it blocks out the sun for a year. And we sort of saw this recently in Australia, where we had the most ghastly bushfires, and the sky in the middle of the day was navy blue and purple, full of smoke. And I said to my friend, this is like nuclear winter. There was no sunlight. Photosynthesis ceases, and most of the 30 million species on the planet that cohabitate with us will die, and we will too. And that'll be the end of Shakespeare and Brahms and Mozart and Beethoven and the rest, Picasso, Rembrandt. But it's all right, because the nuclear war is won. Now, the Russians are suitably paranoid about this policy, as one would be. And because their satellites now only work 8 hours a day, because they're all falling apart, they're decrepit, they can't afford to keep their satellites and early warning system going, they get very jumpy. And it's clinically contraindicated to threaten a paranoid patient, because they often do something really dangerous and threaten you, and people who've worked with patients know that. So one day in January 1995, Norway launched a missile, an old American missile with a weather satellite on top. Now, the Pentagon had told the Kremlin that was going to happen, but the Kremlin lost the papers. If you've been to Russia, they're a bit hopeless. You're really organised. Bang, 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 bang. Probably the most organised nation in the world, maybe apart from the Germans. But the Russians are sort of hopeless, and they lost the stuff. So the missile's launched, and they pick up the telemetry from the missile and the fire from the missile with the infrared satellite, and they say, oh my God, we're under attack. That loop takes 15 minutes. The missiles land in 30. So there's Yeltsin, hardened alcoholic, maybe 2 bottles of vodka a day, Wernicke's encephalopathy, Korsakoff syndrome. They open the football for the first time in the history of the nuclear age in Russia. Hands up those who don't know what the football is. Oh, well, remember when Reagan was shot? They always carry a case An aide always carries a case behind the president with the nuclear codes in it, so if necessary, he can press a button and blow up the planet. When Reagan was shot, they lost the football for 2 days. They didn't know where it was. Remember Alexander Haig said, "I'm in charge now"? Do you remember that? Well, so here's Yeltsin sitting before the football opened, his general standing over his shoulder, and he had a 3-minute time frame to press the button before his missiles would be killed, and he obviously didn't want that to happen. 10 seconds before that time elapsed, the missile veered off course. And we're still here. That was written about in a large article in the New York Times, but was covered near the back page. Instead of 9 miners, removed from mine in Pennsylvania, front page, big headlines, it was back page. So the media is determining the fate of the Earth because no one knows that. But it was well documented in a large New York Times article. Those sort of accidents occur not infrequently in both early warning systems in Russia and America. Once your weapons were nearly set off by a 46-cent computer chip failing. Once a flock of geese flying along nearly set off the infrared detector. Once a rising moon reflected off the clouds and nearly set off the detector. In fact, 100 or so events occur each year, some minor, some more serious, in both sets of early warning systems. So you understand that we live under the twirling sword of the nuclear Damocles every second of every day. In the 80s we knew, in the 90s or the year 2003, we don't know. And I really doubt if George Bush understands this. I think Cheney does because he's been living underground ever since September the 11th. Incidentally, you might like to know that there's a huge city in Virginia that's been built for the senators and congresspeople and the people from the White House. It's got black and white check tiles. It's got a big hospital. And interestingly, the senators and congressmen are not allowed to take their wives down there in the event of nuclear war, but they can take their secretaries. So I always have a good look at their secretaries when I go into lobby. Now, let's go back to Iraq. It was mooted by the Pentagon for 9 months before they went in or invaded that America might use a nuclear bunker buster. They've got a lovely masculine testosterone name. It's called Robust Earth Penetrator. Notice they use that word a lot, robust. It must have some sexual connotation. Maybe these people, if they were given Viagra, wouldn't feel the need to use robust weapons so much. But anyway, I'm just joking. So they were planning to use possibly a small nuclear weapon of about 5 kilotons, Hiroshima was 13 kilotons, to knock out Hussein's underground bunkers. If he'd used chemical or biological weapons, they were planning to use a nuclear weapon. Now, if they did, there's a huge blast, but a huge flash, which could be picked up by the infrared detectors in Moscow and misinterpreted, like they did with the Norwegian weather satellite, that America had launched a first strike. So do you see how tenuous our life is? It's much more tenuous than it was in the 80s because A, we all knew we were under terrible threat, and B, we didn't have the people in the White House that we have now, and C, the people in the White House might like to use nuclear weapons which could trigger this whole system. What makes me so incredibly frustrated as a physician trying to practice global preventive medicine is that people in America don't, or globally, don't know this. Hands up those of you who knew that the weapons are still on first strike, on nuclear alert, and hair trigger alert, and that America has a policy to fight and win a nuclear war. Hands up those of you who knew. This is a focus group. So that, if you look around, that gives you an indication of the danger we're in, because if you don't know there's a danger, you won't work to prevent it happening. Now, I'll talk about North Korea in a while, because I just heard the news on the radio when I was doing the Dennis Bernstein interview, but I want to go back to Iraq. In 1991, when America invaded Iraq, it was a radioactive war. I call it a nuclear war. They used 300 to 800 tons of weapons made of what's called depleted uranium. Now, uranium, when you mine it, has two isotopes, 235, which is what you make bombs out of in nuclear reactors, and 238. 235 is present in 0.7%. It must be enriched to 50% for bombs and 3% for nuclear power plants. The rest that's left behind is 238. 238 is 1.7 times more dense than lead. It's free, it's lying around the country, leaking everywhere, it's carcinogenic, they don't want it, so it's great for the military because it makes terrific anti-tank shells. When you launch they're really anti-tank shells, they're sort of small missiles of solid uranium, they're not uranium tipped. I like the way they say nuclear tipped for the missiles. They're not tipped, they have hydrogen bombs in them. This is not tipped, and the media goes along with this euphemistic language. So you launch this at great velocity, and momentum equals mass by velocity. So you get tremendous momentum, and it slices through the armour of a tank like a hot knife through butter. But it's pyrophoric, so when it hits the tank, it burns, producing tiny particles less than 5 microns in diameter, which can be inhaled into the terminal air passages where there are no cilia next to the alveoli. There are cilia that waft any particles up to the throat and you swallow them throughout most of the tracheobronchial tree, but not in the terminal air passages. Now, uranium-238 is an alpha emitter. It emits 2 protons and 2 neutrons, very dense in mass, usually kills a cell if it hits it, doesn't travel far in the body, and as radiation decreases with the square of the distance on the periphery of that volume, cells remain viable, but the regulatory gene can be damaged and the cell sits quietly, latently, for any time from 5 to 60 years, and then instead of dividing by mitosis and stopping into 2 daughter cells, it goes crazy and induces cancer. Millions of cells, and we can't stop the growth of cells. That's why people die of cancer. So it takes one alpha particle hitting one gene in one cell to kill you. Now, America uses these things with gay abandon, particularly around the city of Basra, and you've been reading about Basra lately. And so what's happened is children are 10 to 20 times more radiosensitive than adults, and I'm a paediatrician, so I know that. They get cancer more readily. So the paediatricians, my colleagues in Basra, who trained in Edinburgh and Great Ormond Street in London, had the same training that I did, very well trained, have noticed that there's a 7 times increased incidence of cancer in the children in Basra. 7 times. That's unheard of in the medical literature. Unheard of. Little girls of 10 are reported to be getting breast cancer. And because of the sanctions imposed by this country in a malicious way, my colleagues can't treat their patients. Now, many childhood cancers are curable now, not adult but childhood. And they stand literally at the foot of the patient's beds weeping because they have no drugs, no chemotherapeutic agents, no radiotherapy instruments, and they just die. Women are terrified to give birth because you see this uranium is being excreted in the semen. The semen is the most precious bodily fluid because it's got the genes for all future generations in the sperm. So the alpha particles are mutating genes, and every gene is important in every sperm, and breaking the chromosomes. So they're giving birth to babies with severe congenital anomalies, babies with anencephaly, no vaults to the skull, no brain. They have a little nubbin of midbrain, so they cough, cry, suck, and die. I've delivered such an infant. Anophthalmos, no eyes. Or cyclopses, single eyes. Gross deformities. Spina bifida. The incidence of congenital anomalies has tripled in Basra. There has been no media about this, or virtually none, in the United States, although I was asked to write 2 articles for the New York Times on 2 separate occasions, and they sent them back and they said, we are unable to publish this. Did they send it to the Pentagon for checking up? The Pentagon has put a lid on the media in this country. There's been a lot of media about it in Europe because the peacekeepers who went from Spain and Italy and the like to Kosovo, where the weapons were again used, have a higher than normal incidence of brain tumours and leukemia. The European Parliament had hearings on it. There's been a lot of press coverage in Europe, but nothing here. Also, because America bombed the water supplies and the electricity system and the sewage systems in the first Gulf invasion, 5,000 children have died every month since 1991 of waterborne disease like cholera, typhoid, dysentery and the like, and there are no drugs, and they're mostly malnourished. So over 600,000 children have died since 1991 because of what America did. You don't kill children for oil. Then, the weapons were again used in, as I said, Kosovo, and then what I didn't say was uranium-238 has a half-life of, guess what, 4.5 billion years. So America's conducting a war crime by scattering this stuff over the desert, and you saw the sandstorms coming in as the men were in their tanks, and this stuff is flowing around all over the place. It goes into the food chain through the water, concentrates in the food chain and is absorbed through the GI system. This is the rest of time. So this will cause random, compulsory genetic engineering forevermore in that exposed population. So then they used it in Afghanistan, the most heavily mined country in the world, and then they used it again, this time, weapons of mass destruction. They are. America's got the largest numbers of weapons of mass destruction in the world. It's got the largest nuclear stockpile. They're currently starting to work on genetic engineering on 29 different bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, 31 viruses at Los Alamos labs, where they're building a P3 lab to do genetic engineering for, they say, defensive mechanisms for biological warfare. You can't use bacteria for defence. And America's got the largest stockpile of chemical weapons as well. And of course, when they made the chemical weapons, they never thought they'd have to dismantle them and get rid of the chemicals, so they don't know how to do that. So they use these weapons again, but particularly in the cities where there are high populations of people. Like in Baghdad, there are 5 million people. In Basra, there are 1 million people. Once again, they destroyed the electricity system, which is antithetical to any Geneva Conventions in war. How dare they? And the sewage systems, and disrupted the water supply, so people don't even have water to drink. And anyway, it's internationally illegal to invade another country. And he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and if he had, who sold them to him or gave them to him? Hussein has been working for the CIA since he was 21. He's a CIA man. And he was armed and equipped and funded by America to fight the Iranians when the Iranians took American hostages. And he used chemical weapons on the Iranians with Rumsfeld express approval in the 80s, and on the Kurds, American chemical weapons with Rumsfeld's express approval. He's a CIA man. But you see, like Noriega, sometimes they get a bit difficult, or America might have wanted to control the oil. Interestingly, the two countries in the Middle East in the 80s with the lowest infant mortality and the highest rate of literacy were, guess what? Iraq and Libya. Oh, that might be because of socialism, because they had a very good educational system, they had an excellent medical care system, paid for by the state, and women were relatively free in Iraq, unlike Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan. Now, what else did America use in Iraq? This time they used what's called fuel air explosives, or daisy cutters. There's an explosion, a huge cloud of propylene and ethylene glycol is released, and that is ignited, producing a massive blast with a compensatory vacuum effect, negative pressure, which pops people's eyeballs out of their sockets, ruptures their lungs and their tympanic membranes. It's called a near-nuclear weapon. They use cluster bombs, 240 bomblets in a bomb, each armed with shards of razor-sharp shrapnel that just slice through people's bodies. Up to 30% don't explode. They're the same size, shape and colour as the food parcels that America drops, painted yellow, containing Pop-Tarts and peanut butter. And as people are hungry in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the children run out to pick up these little things and they get desiccated. So Afghanistan's the most heavily armed country in the world and have got mined. And of course, when you've got mines everywhere, people can't plough their fields. They're ecological weapons as well as weapons that destroy people. And they've got nothing to do with war, because people who get killed in war are the civilians. How many people died? Well, Rumsfeld says they're not counting civilians. How dare he? Would he worry if his wife was killed? She was his girlfriend in high school. Would he worry if his children or grandchildren were killed? I remember briefing a Canadian cabinet once at the request of Pierre Trudeau, and James Schlesinger was there, former Secretary of Defence, and he said, "Don't you Canadians tell us what to do in Central America, we'll do what we need," like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the like. And I thought, I'll get you. And when it came my turn to talk, I dropped the bomb, described the medical effects of nuclear war, and then I turned to her and I said, "You don't kill people for political reasons. Your life is as sacred and precious as any other person in Central America." And apparently he was found later by a member of the Canadian cabinet sort of throwing rocks in a pond, thinking. And he turned to this man and he said, "Well, she's got a point." And as a physician, I cannot understand this movement towards killing that these men have. You notice that hardly any Americans died, and they come back with coffins and flowers, and there are pictures in the New York Times of everyone crying. I'm sad for them. But how many beautiful young Iraqi men were killed too, who were in the, quotes, National Guard? They slaughtered thousands of them. Like your beautiful young men with lovely innocent faces who've never lived, 18 and 19, sent to war to kill. And they're devastated. They come back with nervous breakdowns. They can't sleep. They shoot their wives. They turn into alcoholics. But it's got nothing to do with soldiers fighting soldiers. The Iraqis didn't even have any aeroplanes. And America bombed the hell out of them. And missiles. And anyway, I want to read you some descriptions of what happened in Iraq, which you didn't get in your newspapers because your press is censored, or it allows itself to be censored. This is the article actually about Hussein being employed by the CIA since he was 21. Here's an article by a wonderful reporter from the Sydney Morning Herald, Paul McGough, dated the 4th of April. In the operating theatre, doctors fought to save 3 lives, a woman with serious head and face injuries. And I want you to think of yourselves, because a patient is a patient is a patient. A man who had holes the size of bread and butter plates in his abdomen, and a man with much of his abdominal organs beside him on the operating table. This doctor, who trained in Edinburgh, said, this surgeon, that in 24 hours the hospital had received 33 corpses and more than 180 people injured from 2 incidents that he said was a cluster bomb attack on a village and a mysterious tank attack on a bus heading for Najaf. This man who was in the bus said he'd fled his home but decided to return after being away for only a day. He said, "I could see the American flag on the tank 500 metres down the road from us. There was no warning. There was a noise and a lot of shouting on the bus. Then people's heads seemed to snap away from their bodies, and many of them were dead." His wife sat blank-faced at the end of his bed, clutching a 2-month-old baby to her chest. His brother-in-law said that her mother was amongst the 18 killed. "We had to bury her without her arm because we didn't know how to match all the body parts for the different families. We still wonder what happened. The bus didn't explode and there were no burn marks, but the floor and the inside of the roof were layered with human flesh and the seats were soaked in blood." The doctor said, "We don't know what kind of weapon did this. Their bodies were completely destroyed, but the bus wasn't. People's heads were severed and the viscera was outside their bodies. Their limbs were cut off. It was a horrible thing to see." This is by Robert Fisk from The Independent. "It was an outrage and obscenity. The severed hand on the metal door, the swamp of blood and mud across the road, the human brains inside a garage, the incinerated skeletal remains of an Iraqi mother and her 3 small children in a still smouldering car. Think of if that happened in Berkeley. An invading nation came in and did that to you. How would you feel?" another one. This is a videotape. Much of the videotape was too terrible to show on television, and the agency's Baghdad editors felt able to send only a few minutes of a 21-minute tape that included a father holding out pieces of his baby and screaming cowards. 2 lorry loads of bodies, including women in flowered dresses, could be seen outside the Hilar hospital. My son, my baby, has just had a baby. I couldn't imagine him holding pieces of Claire in his hands. Dr. Nizam El-Adali, who was trained in Edinburgh, said almost all the patients were victims of cluster bombs, babies cut in half and children with amputation wounds, apparently caused by American shellfire and cluster bombs. One woman was seen lying wounded on a bed. She lost 6 of her children and her husband in the attacks. Another man is seen with an arm missing, and a second man, whose wife and 2 of his children were killed, could be seen sitting next to his third and surviving child whose foot was missing. The mortuary of the hospital, a butcher shop of chopped up corpses. This is the last one. An old man cries over the coffin of his daughter. His wife and younger daughter sit on the dirt outside the mortuary in shock. Nadia was lying on a stretcher beside the stone mortuary slab. Her heart lay on her chest, ripped from her body by a missile which smashed through the bedroom window of the family's flat. Her father stood beside the corpse. A shell came down into the room as she was standing by the dressing table, brushing her hair. My daughter had just completed her PhD in psychology and was waiting for her first job. She was born in 1970. She was 33 and very clever. Everyone said I had a fabulous daughter. She spent all her time studying, her head buried in books. She didn't have a care about going out enjoying herself. My other daughter is the same. She has a master's degree in English and teaches at the university. Me? I'm just a lorry driver, a simple man. Now that was done in your name, with your money, and it was done in my name, because Pine Gap in the middle of Australia orchestrated the whole thing, the biggest CIA base in the world. And you've had victory. And then they raided the Baghdad Museum, the cradle of civilization, with the most ancient objects. And the Americans sat by on their tanks and watched it happen. And Rumsfeld said, they were just a few old pots. He is a barbarian, without a doubt. Now that's not funny, I'm serious. He is a barbarian. And they burnt the National Museum, the National Library, containing the very earliest records of writing and mathematics and law. And they destroyed the museum containing the oldest Quran. And the only building they protected was the oil ministry. How dare they? Barbarians indeed. Now, they bombed the hell out of Iraq. They destroyed roads, bridges. They didn't need to, because there's really no offence at all. They just came in and took it. Roads, bridges, railway lines, ports, buildings, the lot. Why? Because, number one, each cruise missile costs $1 million. Who makes them? Lockheed Martin, Raytheon and Boeing. All in here. 32 members of this administration come from those corporations. The rest come from the Heritage Foundation, which is an advertising agency of Lockheed Martin, which funds it. Every time you turn on Jim Lehrer or Fox or Wolf Blitzer, there is a very smooth-talking, usually young male, from the Heritage Foundation or American Enterprise Institute saying how it was very important to get rid of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. All the tanks and all the equipment's made by this. So war is really great, and really this was an arms bazaar, because then they're about to have an arms bazaar, I don't know where, somewhere in the world, and you know the way they sell missiles? They have girls in very skimpy bikinis draped over the missiles. And the sheikhs walk and they say, well, I have 3 of those and 6 of those, just like that. Supermarket for weapons. the international trade now is not really about oil, it's about weapons. And America sells weapons to every country they possibly can. And this is all in the book as well. But also, it was an arms bazaar, but also, because of everything that's been destroyed, America's thinking of taking the money in escrow that belongs to Iraq for the sale of oil to pay for the rebuilding of Iraq, and taking $100 billion of your money to pay for the rebuilding of Iraq, stealing your money. Who are they? Halliburton. Who works for Halliburton? Cheney, who still receives $1 million a year from Halliburton. He's a really wicked man, Cheney. He's a wicked man. He was doing business with Hussein until 1998, Halliburton was. And they got the contract to rebuild Iraq. That man should be put in jail for fraud. He should. And who else got a contract? Bechtel. Who works with Bechtel? George Shultz. It's incest, absolute incest and nepotism. And you should not allow it to happen, because the corporations run your country. They spend $400 billion a year on weapons. That's nearly $500 billion. If you spend $1 million a minute since Jesus was born, you would have just about got to $1 trillion. Now, as well as that, they're destroying government, because when I used to be on television in the 80s, little girls, very pretty, would say to me, but isn't big government bad for us? And I think, where does that come from? It came straight from the Heritage Foundation. They are destroying your government. They believe in socialism for the military-industrial complex, but capitalism for all of you. Schools are being closed. In Michigan, they're turning off every third light globe in the government buildings because they're bankrupt. Libraries are closing. Hospitals are not being well financed. And 41 million people have no health insurance. And you're the only Western nation in the whole world without free medical care. Paid for by what? By your tax dollars. So you are allowing these robber barons to convince you that being against the invasion of Iraq was unpatriotic. Oh, but you mustn't criticise them. I mean, what would people think of me in the land of the free and the home of the brave? And the Democrats are no flaming better. None. John Kerry, he'll receive money from the military-industrial corporations. Kucinich is good. He's good. I don't know if he's got the charisma to get there, and I think the media might decimate him, although he got to be mayor of Cleveland when he was only 28, so he's an interesting character. Now, in the 80s, we had a revolution in America, and it was the Second American Revolution. It was quiet, sagacious, dignified. When I first started in 78, I came here and I said, we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons, and people said, who do you think you are? You're an alien, and you're a woman, and you're naive and stupid. And it was my naivety that got me there. Because then I founded Physicians for Social Responsibility. And in 1978, most Americans would say, better dead than red. The hatred of the Soviet Union was much more profound than people's worry about Hussein. I don't know if you remember that, but it was true clinical paranoia. They can still bomb you and reduce you to smithereens in half an hour. And so we started saying, well, do you know what happens if a bomb drops on Boston? And people said, no. So we did the bombing run, and I'll describe it in a minute. And people said, ooh, nuclear war's bad for our health. And we got around all over the country, and we'd do a symposium here, and the Bishop of San Francisco said, I think Jesus wouldn't approve of nuclear war. So they did a pastoral letter opposing nuclear wars. Then the Methodist bishops did it. Then I was invited to the Southern Baptists. And you know they're conservative, but I'm a conservative too, because I'm for conserving God's creation. I'm not a radical at all. I'm a doctor and I'm a conservative. And all I did was speak Jesus to them, love thine enemy and do good to those who hate you, and they had to buy it. There was nothing they could do about it. Then I was asked to speak to the annual Morticians Association national meeting, and I said, why do you want me to come and talk to you? And they said, we don't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, don't worry, you'll be one yourself. So it was an interesting time, but in 5 years we converted almost everyone supporting nuclear war to 80% opposing. And we nearly got there. And we brought an end to the Cold War with all other countries in the world, with Gorbachev, who actually saved the planet, and I once thanked him for that. And that truly was a revolution in thinking in America. Now, we didn't finish our job because Clinton let us down. Now what we have to do is all regroup, millions of us who were active in the 80s and the young ones, and we've got to finish our job. So what I'm going to do is set up an institute, Nuclear Policy Research Institute. I'm doing it now in Washington to take on the right-wing think tanks in the media. So Rumsfeld never goes on alone. We say, Mr. Secretary, that's not true. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Heritage Foundation has always someone with equal time, with an opposite point of view, telling people the truth. So it will create debate in the American mind. People say, did you see that the other night, the dinner party? Yeah, well, I don't know if I agree with her. Yeah, but what about this? And once people start thinking and activating their brains, the truth will out. And they'll start reading this, which is the new Grey's Anatomy, because we're all physicians to a dying planet. Planets in the intensive care unit. And we're going to get people on the media by hook or crook. And people say, what can I do? I feel so hopeless. I have got a drive inside my stomach that I'm damned if I'm going to let those people blow up the planet. And I don't care how I do it. I had the same drive in the 80s with Physicians for Social Responsibility, 23,000 doctors in white coats talking about the medical effects of nuclear war, and we're very credible. Actually, the government should be funding us because we're for saving life on the Earth, and I would like some government funding, please. We need $1 million a year, but in the absence of that, and they should be, they fund everything else. In the absence of that, if you can help us, we've raised about $375, we need another $400,000 this year. If you've got money, if you've got friends, it's global health insurance. Invest in your future and the future for your children. Our goal is to cause nuclear abolition in 5 years. Russia wants to get rid of her weapons. America's holding it up. She's about to build 500 new nuclear weapons a year. And we're going to close down all the nuclear reactors in America, 103, because terrorists don't need nuclear weapons anymore. They're deployed all over the country. Melt a nuclear power plant down, you devastate an area the size of Pennsylvania, and no one can ever live there again. And it's easy to melt a nuclear power plant. I could melt one down in a day or less. You cut the external electricity supply, you destroy the cooling water, you could infiltrate the control system, and there's virtually no security of any significance at the nuclear power plants at this time, even though you've got homeland security. So we're going to close down. So we'll end the nuclear age in 5 years. Is that optimistic? Is that naive? If I have a patient with meningococcal septicemia and they come into the casualty department, they're covered with red spots, if I don't give them an injection of penicillin right now, they'll die. And there's no, well, maybe we can, maybe we should, let's have a meeting, do a study. Patient's dead. And we are in the intensive care unit, I kid you not. And I haven't even talked about global warming, ozone depletion, deforestation, species extinction, overpopulation, and all the rest. But I believe if people get focused on this, their eyes start opening, and the scales fall off, and their peripheral vision opens up, and they start saying, who's doing this, and why, and how? And they will get the corporations out of the government, out of the Congress, out of the Senate, and out of the White House, where they have no right to be. Every state in this country has a law to deregister a corporation if they behave in irresponsible or immoral ways, and that could be used, that law. But more than that, you need another revolution, and I don't mean blood and guts. I mean peaceful, sagacious, led by Joan of Arc and Martin Luther Kings, and you're all here in the room tonight, if you care. And if my child had been diagnosed with leukemia, God help me, nothing would stop me. I'd find the best doctor in the world, the best hospital, I'd spend everything, and if the child died, I'd never recover. So it's the energy that a lioness has to protect her cubs that we've got to use. And you can't just say, well, I've got a full tummy and I'm busy and I can't do it. Every morning you get up and look in the mirror and say, what am I going to do today to save the planet? Don't do little things either, do big things. I'm going to just drop the bomb on Berkeley, and then I'll describe what one woman did, and then I'll end. You know, sometimes you're listening to NPR, National Petroleum Radio, and you hear, ooh, this is just a test of the emergency broadcasting system. This time they'd say, this is not a test, we're under nuclear attack, you've got 10 minutes to get to the nearest fallout shelter. Do you know where one is? No, because we've forgotten, we think the danger's gone away. Well, the bomb's going to come in here, and certainly there's at least one bomb targeted on Berkeley alone, let alone Oakland, let alone San Francisco, let alone Stanford. Comes in at 20 times the speed of sound, so you won't hear it. Explodes here, and it's a big Russian bomb, and you're targeted by big Russian bombs with the heat of the sun. And it digs a hole 3/4 of a mile wide and 800 feet deep, turning us, the building, and the earth below to radioactive fallout, shot up in that roiling mushroom cloud. 5 miles from here in all directions, think of where you live, everyone will be vaporized. A little boy in Hiroshima was reaching up to catch a red dragonfly in his hand against the blue sky, and there was a blinding flash, and he literally vaporized and left a shadow behind him on the pavement, which is in the Hiroshima Museum. That was a little tiny bomb. 20 miles in all direction, everyone lethally burnt. Burn patient, the most difficult we ever treat, takes a year to treat a severely burned patient, hundreds of units of blood and plasma, skin transplants, and then we often still lose them. Don't worry though, the White House has been stockpiling large quantities of morphia just in case it's to be a nuclear war. We'll be dead or similarly injured, no hospitals, no syringes, nothing to do. 50 miles out, if you look at the flash, you'll be instantly blinded with retinal burns. Winds of 500 miles an hour, and you've seen the pictures of nuclear weapons exploding and houses just being flattened, suck people out of buildings, through windows that have been popcorned, and shards of glass flying through the air at 100 miles an hour decapitate people, people flying through the air as missiles, and they hit the nearest solid object and they're dead. Then the whole area will be engulfed in a firestorm of 3,000 square miles. So if you get in a fallout shelter, like in Dresden, the firestorm suck the oxygen out of the shelter and you'll be asphyxiated. Then the fires will coalesce throughout the United States and this whole country will be incinerated. There will be millions of corpses, animal and human alike, and as the radiation is so intense, the bacteria and viruses multiply and mutate to become more lethal and virulent, while if anyone survives, their immune mechanism is depleted by the radiation, and there will be epidemics if anyone survives of polio, typhoid, cholera, plague, you name it. People will have to live underground for the next 6 months because it will be too radioactive to come out, and they say they might use the old people for food gatherers because we won't live long enough to get our cancers. But really, then nuclear winter will ensue, the globe covered with this cloud, freezing temperatures in the dark, and everyone and everything will die. That's the background of what I've been talking about tonight.